Robert Perkins stood here one year, and he did exactly that. There was a lot of commotion in the room, and what he did is like the wind. He told a story that I cannot tell, but maybe one day we're going to have that also on the WCS website, because we got it in the film. So thank you. Without any further ado, Kate Weeks, the facilitator of the next session, is going to introduce herself and next batch of speakers. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back for the second panel session of the day. Next up, we have Jeremy Ward, who is currently the curator at the Canadian Canoe Museum. And Jeremy will be doing a presentation on freighter canoes, an illustrated exploration of the iconic northern workboat. And he's quite familiar with building canoes himself, but he finds it more lucrative to speak about canoes than to build them, so that's the route that he's taken. He has some experience with breaking canoes as well. He spent his honeymoon 2 weeks in a birch bark canoe and managed to break the end off of that canoe. And then he fixed it, and the marriage continued. And he made a 36-foot birch bark canoe and managed to break that in half when he was launching it. Also fixed that canoe, and so he has some talent in both breaking and fixing canoes, and perhaps that's why the museum's kept him around all these years. In any case, we're looking forward to hearing his presentation, and I'll keep things moving along. I'll get him up here. So please welcome Jeremy Ward. Good luck.
Sound check. Good. Well, thank you very much. I suspect many people in this room are familiar with the subject of my topic. And I think a lot of people sometimes look at these and really wonder why we've attached the handle canoe to that word freighter. They clearly have evolved into something great and something rather different. When I look at these boats, I see them as the last real genuine working boats of the canoe family. Many years ago, I was with Bruce Hodgins. We were up on James Bay, Chisasibe, and I watched with mouth wide open as a freighter canoe came across from a level horizon, family, dogs, grandma on board, and a snowmobile balanced across the gunnels. And I thought, now that's a boat I'd like to learn more about. But in fact, my love affair with these goes back to a much younger age. When I was 4, I was given these books. These are children's classics, Normie's Moose Hunt, Normie's Goose Hunt by Vi Cowell, 1968, writing out of Moosonee. If anybody knows Vi, please introduce me. I'd like to have the Canoe Museum reprint these wonderful books. I also tried to cover up the fact the blue one is a library book that I've had for 40 years, and right after this presentation, I'm going to return it. Before launching into this, I would like to give a heartfelt thanks to George for this opportunity, to Alex and the symposium as well, to bring this presentation. Mine might be an alternate path to James's presentation last night, where I see James was really bringing the Canoe Museum off of its property and out to this symposium and really to the big wide world. I would like today to bring us, if I can, to the mountain, to the Canadian Canoe Museum. I know a number of you have been back here perhaps with me for a walkabout. This is one of my favorite places in the world, and really this is what keeps me, after all these years, engaged with this collection. It's just limitless. 640 canoes, depending on how you count, kayaks, also manufacturing forms, thousands of small artifacts, an expanding archive and reference library. If any of you are trying to play Where's Waldo, if you look to the far right corner, you'll see a lot of freighter canoes up on the wall, and we're going to visit those in a little while. But more importantly, a walk through this room, I find, is to discover endless relationships and stories that are unfolding, that are connecting. And I'm really surprised oftentimes at the richness of these connections. The best way to get a sense of the depth of our collection, really, and its potential is to pick at a thread of this fabric and see where it leads. At its simplest, the canoe is an ideal platform for tinkering. Humans excel at tinkering. They excel at tinkering with other people's tinkerings. And with boats and aircraft, most noticeably, I think all tinkerings come at a cost or a compromise. And this leads to some of the most marvelous innovations. For instance, as we walk to the back of that big hangar, we're going to see a number of canoes rigged for sail. People have early on tried to find ways to improve or to reduce the amount of effort needed to haul these boats about. Chief Michel Joe last night was showing us how effective a sail can be at enhancing the paddling. It didn't take long for somebody to say, well, if I lay down flat on the bottom, drop a centerboard through the hull, I can increase the sail area and go faster. And then some clever folks said, well, what if we got the pilot right out of the boat? That means we can increase the sail area even faster and clean up at the races. And so you can see he's out on a sliding seat. And the last iteration of this, which we still call a canoe, this is the International 10 square meter sailing canoes. This is, for my money, is still part of our family because of the genetics that we've witnessed of this boat as it's been tweaked and modified along the way. So my mission here today, I think, really is to connect these two boats that are behind a few wonderful dugout canoes, ancient dugout canoes pulled out of the muck of lake bottoms and riverbeds. On the left is a big birch bark canoe, an icon of Canadian mythology, if you will. This is the largest of the bark canoes used for the fur trade, the Canot de Maître, the Montreal canoe, the 6-fathom birch bark canoe. I'd like to see if we can and look at the connections between it and that. Well, it's not a lobster boat. That's usually most people's comment when we walk in and we see this gray freighter canoe here, and really understand a little bit more about that gray boat and what connects the two. Going back as far as we can imagine in terms of experience and canoeing. Sorry, canoeing. Am I still on? Canoeing traditions. Of course, large canoes are by no means an innovation of the fur trade period. Chief Michel Joe last night was talking to us about the ocean-going canoes on the East Coast and how they would have been an absolute necessity to make crossings such as that. I just can't imagine the bravery you had to do your trip. Same thing on the West Coast with the dugout canoes. And for the purposes of the length of my talk here, I'm going to just focus on the woodland traditions, the essentially portable watercraft necessitated by our landscape and waterways. But we will, as we chart this story, we'll end up on the third ocean coast in the Arctic. Early writings certainly talk about large canoes, some canoes with 50 people in them. One of the early Champlain expeditions, when he was still second mate, was off Nova Scotia, and a 30-foot birch bark canoe was acquired, painted red from the Mi'kmaq people, and it was sailed back to France, hoping to drum up more support from the Crown. Chief Joe, I think if you were turned down at Calgary looking for that Mi'kmaq canoe there, we should really go to France together and see what happened to this 30-footer. I expect that after it was unloaded on the Seine River, it was paddled by the sailors, the matelots, who I can sure did a great job of that. But then it ended up, I would expect, in Paris, maybe buried down at the basement of the Louvre, and eventually had a piano parked on top of it or something. We don't know what's happened to that large canoe. I'd sure love to find out. Large canoes just weren't terribly common in a traditional setting because they're not terribly useful. They have a shorter lifespan, of course, a lot more strain on the hull. You can't make the birch bark really that thicker or stronger, and the framing to make that more robust doesn't really help strengthen the bark. So you're also limited to the waterways you can select. Think about it like being in a car that will only drive on the 400 series highways. For the eddy turns and navigating shallow draft rivers, the extra crew you need, they're just not, they're not really coming into their own as a necessity until we have something like a fur trade or a transnational shipping business that requires this kind of method. During the development of the fur trade period, the large canoes certainly came into their own. There's been a lot discussed and explored on that topic, and we also see canoe building sites or factories concentrated where they're most needed. This would be down near Trois-Rivières on St. Lawrence River, at the lakehead area of Lake Superior, and of course on James Bay. A very important site was developed in the bottom right-hand corner of James Bay at a place called Fort Charles. This was Hudson Bay Company's first toehold in North America, later to be called Rupert House, and then today much more familiarly known as Waskaganish. The Rupert River was deemed to be a major artery into the interior for trade. A survey in 1820 said, while they were looking to see if the East Main would be it, it was proven not to be, so the Rupert River was sanctioned the main artery into the interior for resupply that would connect them as far as Lake Mistassini. In fact, over the height of land would take them right down to the St. Lawrence River. So this became a very important place, not only for the packets of the trade goods, but also for canoe manufacturing. As you can imagine, birch bark canoes don't last very long, and so there's a need to constantly reinvent the fleet. The largest canoes, the 36-footers, might have only lasted 1 year of good hard use. They would be retired to secondary purpose after that. And it's not long before you exhaust your local supply. I led a project over a decade ago where we delving into the literature, the artwork, the journals, recreated a full volume birch bark canoe of the largest size, this 36-footers. This would be almost 6 feet wide, 30 inches deep, carries 8,000 pounds on the water, so the literature goes. And our objective was to build one of these, a brand new one, none of them had survived, and beat the hell out of it. Match it to the folklore, to the claims, paddle it, pole it, sail it, line it, portage it, put it through all of the beatings that a Montreal canoe would have, and see how it managed. Oh, I'm sorry. Where's my mouse? In the supplying of this industry, birch bark actually became an important staple, secondary almost commerce as a trade item. And by the 1820s at Michipicoten, we know records say that a roll of good grade canoe bark was the equivalent of a plu, or a made beaver pelt, which doesn't seem like a lot given the hazards if you're climbing an aluminum ladder to harvest a roll of bark. Now, a roll of canoe bark was 1 fathom wide and 4 fathoms long. This is 6 feet wide and 24 feet long as a standard grade piece of canoe bark. It was all I could do to get close to that when we were building this canoe. If you look at the right-hand end, just down in the right-hand corner, you see a bit of yellow spray paint on that. And well, in fact, I had an agreement with logging companies to go in and skin trees before they cut them down. And so there's yellow spray paint all over the inside of our canoe. That's sort of a sign of the times, I guess, today. But there's a whole lot of bark in the wings in that photograph waiting to be turned into canoe. The detailed photograph in the upper corner is a fascinating or photograph if you know what's behind it. It's a Hudson Bay Company canoe pulling in 1901, Kippawa Station. So it's actually bringing furs to the train line, and those furs will end up heading down towards Montreal by train. So the canoe in its latter years of the fur trade was still serving to service the smaller arteries that fed now to the train lines. But if perched on top of the canoe behind the bowman are a couple of rolls of canoe bark, and they're also being brought to the canoe manufacturing sites. So it gives us a sense that these became common staples as a sidebar to the business of the day. Producing these canoes certainly took a lot of effort. Some surprising discoveries researching the record for the large boats. In 1830s, there was a note made in the Fort William Journal at Thunder Bay, or Lakehead of Lake Superior, that the Antoine Collin, the canoe builder, began a canoe for the governor, for George Simpson. Just under 2 weeks later, Antoine Collin finishes the governor's canoe and begins another. And that's a painting by Armstrong in the upper right corner from a few decades later of another canoe made for the governor. So these didn't look half bad, really, did they? What is not mentioned in the literature or the journals of the fort is, in fact, Antoine Collin might have unrolled some birch bark and staked it down, but the project was then taken over by teams of canoe building Anishinaabe women, and sometimes their daughters, who would be the bobbin side of a sewing machine, sewing these hulls together. In the lower right corner is Jen Bernard. She's here tonight. She's a longtime staff member with me at the Canadian Canoe Museum. She's our lead animator from the school programming. And she and Rhonda McIsaac there are finishing the side seams for the boat. That's a project that took us about a month and a half to do. I would expect they would have done that in a day to keep these boats in production. Jen's daughter, Claire, was quite young at the time and was very helpful for being shoved into the end of the canoe where it got really quite tight to sew back. Just a quick photo here to show an important element of bark canoes that you might be aware of, that they are built unusually from the outside in. Skin first, framing in second. And this is essential to the way that they're actually taken apart and rebuilt when damaged underway. And as Kate mentioned, I have a little bit of experience doing that. Launching the canoe, shortly after this one was broken in half, we rebuilt it and then filled it up. She's now carrying about 6,000 pounds of water ballast in olive barrels. We ran out of olive barrels. We didn't get up to the full payload of 8,000 pounds. But you can still see she had about 14 inches of freeboard, so there's still a lot of capacity left in the boat. Quite an amazing ratio of capacity to weight that canoes provide. I don't need to tell you that, but I was surprised to discover that a canoe that would carry 8,000 pounds of load only weighs 340 pounds on the water. We did get out, stretch its legs a bit in the lower right. We're filming with the BBC, and we're just approaching the Big Pine Rapids on the French River as we were poling and tracking the canoe, or setting poles and tracking the canoe up the rapids. Now, I'm going to leave that story behind for a moment here and look at another story that's unfolding. Late 19th century, a lot of northern exploration is going on. People are flooding there, of course, for the Klondike. In the lower right, we see J.B. Terrell standing looking a little bit skeptical, looking at a Peterborough canoe that was made for his expedition. That was used in their advertising literature in 1809. The other photographs are from geological surveys in Alaska. These are all canoes from the Peterborough area. These are industrial manufactured, all wood canoes. Very complex joinery involved in them. The whole notion of a waterproof skin is set aside for these. And these really served that adventurous movement that was sending people up into the north. We recently acquired a canoe that just this year that belonged to George Douglas, a name I know has come up here several times at past symposium. And George was exploring the copper mine the same year that the Titanic was headed towards the ice off Newfoundland. And George was an avid paddler, but he was also an avid sailor. And so one litmus test that really shows us this is one of George's boats is that upper right, you see he's got a little turning block there. He was always fitting sailing hardware into all of his canoes that I've seen, just to find any opportunity. Paddle when you must, I guess, sail when you can. George's book, Lands Forlorn, he writes about traveling up the copper mine, and I was really excited to find out whether or not we had George's canoe. Maybe Polaris, the one he actually paddled from Great Bear Lake overland and then down the copper mine to the coast, or Procyon, which was another canoe that he'd stashed near Fort Norman on the Mackenzie. Douglas talks about punching a hole in the bottom of the canoe, and he spent the next morning fixing the bottom with a strip of sheet brass. So the second thing we did when we acquired this canoe was flip it over. And if you look in the large background photograph, you can see a strip of sheet brass. I was pretty excited about that, but then discovered that George mentions punching several more holes in the canoe, fixing those with brass, and ours only has one such repair. Now, a little sidebar to that strip of brass coiled up in the upper corner came to us from Walter Walker, who recently died at 102. And when he began learning canoe building at Lakefield Canoe Company, who made this boat, he later left to us all of his tools and equipment, and I found this little roll of brass sheet metal. I had no idea what it was doing in his toolbox until I looked at George's canoe, and in fact, this would have probably been a factory-approved method of keeping your boat underway. It would require a small egg beater drill, soft nails, or clenching tacks, some of the sheet metal, and so on. It was a very different manner and method of maintaining a boat while underway, and very, I think, culturally different from what was being used by First Nations peoples in the far north. Culturally, it was so different from a bark canoe to need to address the machinery of the planking and all of that. Back to our location on James Bay at Rupert House. Birch bark supplies might be dwindling. Certainly, canvas is becoming more affordable. And a fellow in Rupert House, who later went on to be chief, in 1902 experimented by unrolling a bolt of canvas on the ground and building a birch bark canoe using canvas. This was also being done elsewhere, and it made a relatively good boat. It certainly showed promise. And for the next 18 years, they were building birch bark canoes using canvas as the outer rind. Hudson Bay Company supplied the paint to make them waterproof, and it was something of a cultural shift, but in fact, the essence of these boats is very familiar. They knew how to fix them, they knew how to get at them when they needed to, and keep them going. Quick story, when I was, some years ago, I was on a canoe trip in central Quebec with a friend, and we picked up a wood canvas canoe when we arrived from a contact. He had recently canvassed his canoe, but he hadn't worked into the canvas the hardening paste that is essential for these, and it was a secret recipe by every company that produced them. He just simply painted them like these were painted. We were doing our canoe trip in late October, and after about 2 days of canoeing, paddled over a sharp beaver cutting, and it just caught the weave of the canvas through the paint and cut a 3-foot slit out of the canvas, and we flooded right to the gunnels in the middle of a lake. Thankfully, we're able to figure that out. But certainly, raw canvas with paint on it, they would have been busy maintaining those boats like nobody's business, from my recollection anyway. 1920s, another shift comes to the making of these fur trade canoes at Rupert's House. This is an important step, that a mold, a canoe building mold, which is really like a cobbler's last, shaped like the airspace inside of a canoe, and it has these stripes of metal. We saw one last night on, was it the Nunaluk documentary, moldering away in the grass. You can see the metal strips on this form. You're now building a canoe from the inside out rather than from the outside in. It's a paradigm shift, to use that word. It was a way to speed up production, and Rupert House is trying this out. What's very interesting, though, is that the canoe builders at Rupert House were still going down to Nottoway and Broadback rivers to the south to get their cedar, but they would split up the logs, they would dress them down with crooked knives into ribs, just hand carving these canoe ribs just as they would for a birch bark canoe, and they'd bring them back and they'd assemble them over a space-age canoe building mold like this. So it's interesting to imagine this sort of blending of a very ancient practice with new innovations. The upper detail on the left shows one such canoe pulled off of a form, now getting canvas stretched over it. Thank you. Chestnut Canoe Company gets into the mix here, and they are producing canoes. This is for brigades, Fort Chimo moving into the interior of Ungava to Mackenzie. And a tour in our back building, you'll see original chestnut forms. Some of these were used to make the canoes in the back photograph. If you look at the canoe in the upper right, the canoe building form, it's an important change that's happening here in that they're modifying these double-ender paddling canoes in order to be able to hang motors off of them. These are called Y-sterns. At the waterline, they're still double-ender paddling canoes. They are a displacement hull, but you have a nice convenient ledge to hang a motor off. There is also, of course, later experimentations to square off the backs and make a much bigger motorboat. Many of you, or some of you, might have rattled out the Rupert River to Waskaganish in the 60s and seen this site. Between 1920 and 1954, over 1,300 of these freighter canoes were made at Rupert House. These were now officially called Rupert House canoes, and they were being shipped all around the north. You can see in the lower photograph here a Rupert House freighter canoe being loaded up and being taken out of the community. The photograph in the upper left, from a canoe building point of view, is an important one because you see the flare right at the gentleman's ankles. In fact, the hull is in a bell curve up to the gunnels, keeping the wash out of the hull. if you think about stretching canvas over a boat, it will not follow that curve. It'll describe a straight line rather than sucking in tight. So they've now been modifying their forms for the use of fiberglass and resin. By the 1970s, the canoe building industry there is wrapping up. But I'm delighted to say that our canoe at the Canoe Museum, the middle canoe there is one of their 20-foot wide Y-stern freighter canoes. It's my hope that at some point we'll bring her down and bring her back to glory with a skin of canvas on it. There are very few of these surviving today. Of course, that would be a boat you could say was used hard and put away wet, and they would be allowed to rot on the shore. There's another Rupert House canoe in our collection. This is a much bigger one. She's 24 feet, named Chichu. And she was bought by a game warden who brought her down to Lake Ontario as his patrol boat. He named it for George Chichu from Moose Factory, who was his moose hunting guide when he'd go up there. Now, the game warden, named Claude Winters, handy with tools, he built the wheelhouse cabin and all of that. The driver's seat for this boat comes out of a Second World War bomber trainer. And you can see on the transom there that bell curve flaring that we saw in that other canoe that was flipped over. This is very much a Rupert House canoe of their largest size. One last story or company I want to tell you about as we wrap this up. And this is the enduring legacy today, a company that you'll be familiar with if you've landed on beaches across the north. This is Canot Nord-Ouest out of Prévost, Quebec. It's a story that takes us back to the 20s in Alberta. A Francophone family is building canoes for prospectors, and a young fellow named Augustin Guerrier-Py, he's seen in that photograph wearing the cap, works for a company that's making canoes for the Hudson Bay Company in Alberta. It's the same company that supplied the mold that was shipped to Rupert House. So in fact, our company here, Mr. Guerrier-Py, where he learned in Alberta, is also connected to the Rupert House building. I know it's a bit complex or twisted here, but I find this an exciting development that deserves more research because it really reminds us how small the Arctic is, even though the distances can sometimes be so great. If you've been up north, this will be a site that we might see less and less of as the other boats get on the scene and take over, but still the freighter canoes are very much valued. They don't look like the original birch barks or the double enders. They've been modified to become really individual family hunting boats, moving hunt camp, bringing snowmobiles, you name it, or drums of oil. And Canot Nord-Ouest, this company out of Prévost, they're in their third generation of family ownership. It's owned by the two grandsons of the original maker. They produce about 160 of these big freighter canoes a year. 90% of their sales are to Nunavik, and Northwest Territories. So this is really a story that's deeply embedded in the Arctic. And this company is carrying on, for my money, a very ancient tradition that still stirs my heart. Thank you very much.
Well,
25 minutes on the nose.
Good timing.